Banner Lane was the site of a wartime shadow factory in Coventry, England, run by the Standard Motor Company and dedicated to making Bristol Hercules aero engines. The war surplus plant was taken over by Standard in 1946 to make Ferguson tractors, and it was made Standard's registered office. After the 1959 sale of Standard's part ownership of the tractor to Massey Ferguson, it became Massey Ferguson's base for tractor building operations until production ceased in 2003 and the site was redeveloped for housing. And if you've ever wondered where the name Banner Lane came from, well, it was named after the military banners flown near Broad Lane by none other than Oliver Cromwell himself during the English Civil War. Hello everybody, you're very welcome back to the channel. So yes, Banner Lane, this is one a lot of you Massey Ferguson fans have been waiting for. It's one that I've been waiting for, and it's one that I have really enjoyed making. I've spoken to a good few people who were actually on site working at the Banner Lane factory throughout various periods of its history. I'd like to say a big thank you to all those who got in contact with me to share their information, share their knowledge, their stories, and indeed some of their pictures from inside of Banner Lane. And in particular, Paul Ryder, who worked on the shop, on the floor, manufacturing floor, Ian Lee, who was the technical service training manager for Banner Lane, and David Blackwood, who was an engineer at Banner Lane from 1990 to 1995. A huge thank you to them and for all the information and inside information that I have today that not many people have, that came directly from these people. So thank you, huge thank you to them. So this video is going to deal with, of course, the early years, pre-tractor manufacture into the early days of the TE20, the 100 series, the 300 series, and of course the final demise of Banner Lane, why it came about, what happened, what were the situations that led to the closure of Banner Lane, and of course what became of the site. And I do have a lot of brilliant information on everything that went on, everything that happened throughout that period. So as always, we'll start at the beginning. So at the beginning, it was a shadow factory. So what was that? A shadow factory. So in May 1939, the Air Ministry sought a facility to manufacture Bristol Hercules aero engines, and construction of a plant commenced later that year on an 80-acre site just outside of Coventry. With over 1 million square foot of floor space, the Banner Lane site was one of the largest shadow factories erected at government expense, costing £1.7 million to build and set up for production. A lot of money back in 1939. The new plant missed the summer and autumn 1940 bombing raids of the Coventry Blitz and was fully functional before the end of that year. Its curious similarity to other shadow factories was because the buildings were designed by the government's own architects. Now, that was a strange one for me, because you'd think if you were building buildings that you didn't want to be bombed, you didn't want to be identified from the air as being a government building, you might make them all a little bit different. But no, they were all built pretty much the same and of the same design, and they were easily identifiable. So the business was run actually for a £40,000 fee per annum, a management fee by Standard Motor Company, enabling products and plant to benefit from Standard's expertise in making similar, if obviously much less complex products. With some of the parts being produced at Rover's shadow factory at Acocks Green, the Hercules engines were complex machines of 38.7 litres capacity, having 14 cylinders in 2 radial rows using sleeve valves rather than poppet valves, and with an output of up to 1,735 horsepower, of course depending on the application. When production ended in 1945, more than 20,000 Hercules engines were built at Banner Lane. Other wartime products managed by Standard but made at a Canlead location of a further shadow factory nearby included the Bristol Beaufighter and the de Havilland Mosquito twin-engine fighter bomber. So obviously there had been a manufacturing base at Banner Lane long before Massey Ferguson tractors started rolling off the production lines. Many of the original buildings, including what was known as the Ferguson Centre, home of the museum, were built in 1932 for the Standard Motor Company. It was in 1938, with the threat of World War II hanging over Europe, that the factory itself was built and part of the government's shadow factory armament programme. Owned by the state, these factories were sited on the outskirts of major cities, away from the threat of enemy bombs, but in industrial areas where the necessary expertise was at hand. From 1939 until 1945, some 2,000 Bristol Aero engines were manufactured at Banner Lane under the direction of Sir John Black of the Standard Motor Company. However, at the end of the war, the factory was no longer required, and Sir John Black was anxious to find a use for it and struck a deal with Harry Ferguson to produce the Ferguson system TE20 for him, with the first tractor rolling off the production line on the 6th of July 1946. A complete total of 517,651 TE20s of different variants were built within the production, finally coming to an end in 1957. So that was over a 10-year span, some 50,000 tractors per year of the TE20. In 1953, Canadian firm Massey Harris had purchased Harry Ferguson's interest in the company, and in 1957, Massey Ferguson, as the company became known, launched the red and grey MF35 and the MF65. But even then, Massey Ferguson did not have their own UK production facility, and it wasn't until 1959 that a deal was finally struck. So yeah, after the war, the shadow factory was no longer required by Bristol. However, decisions between Standard and Harry Ferguson in 1945 to build Ferguson tractors in the UK resulted in Standard signing a 10-year lease for the Banner plant, costing £36,000 per annum. The intention was to build up to 500 tractors per day, for which Standard would receive a fee for each one produced, and from mid-1946 until the end of 1947, 20,800 new tractors had been built. At the height of production, over 6,000 people were employed, and in 10 years, more than 500,000 Ferguson T tractors had been produced at Banner Lane. Disagreements between Standard and Ferguson culminated in Standard breaking all connections with both Ferguson and tractor production in the summer of 1959. By this time, Harry Ferguson Limited had formed a merger with, obviously, Massey Harris to become Massey Harris Ferguson, and later shortened to Massey Ferguson. All Standard's tractor assets were sold to Massey Ferguson on the 31st of August 1959, and Banner Lane entered the sole ownership of Massey Ferguson. By 2000, the plant covered 1.8 million square foot, and tractor output was in excess of 70,000 per annum, the majority for export. However, increasing numbers of Massey Ferguson tractors were being built elsewhere, most notably in Beauvais in France. In order to rationalise production, it was decided that either Beauvais or Banner Lane will be shut down, but pressure from the French government and workers made Beauvais most difficult to close, sealing Banner Lane's fate. The tractor production line closed on Christmas Eve in 2002, when the last tractor, number 3,307,996, was completed. The factory continued some operations, finishing partially complete tractors as well as providing gearboxes and other machine parts to Beauvais, whilst they prepared for production of the existing 4300 series, which will continue there until 2004. The final Banner Lane designed tractor series was then succeeded in the same year by the new 5400 series and lesser known Finnish built 4400 series that was badge engineered the Valtra A series. So we look at the demise then. So a housing development called Banner Brook Park now occupies the site, and which had been planned to build the region of 1,000 new homes, together with an entire infrastructure including shops and schools. So the development, in October 2004, plans to redevelop the site were submitted, and as the first daffodils herald the spring of 2005, the bulldozers moved in and Birmingham-based company DSM started to clear the 94-acre formerly Massey Ferguson site. The first thing to go was the circular test track, which was situated to the northwest corner of the site. Next to disappear were the enormous heavy engineering shops where racing cars were manufactured since 1946. Gears and shafts had been produced for Ferguson's Little Grey Fergie, then the Massey Ferguson 65, and obviously the Red Giants, and latterly the 4300 and 4200 range. Then it was the turn of the main assembly shop, located slap bang in the middle of the site, where once the engines, transaxles, front axles, wheels and cabs had taken their turn along with the complete tractor and it had rolled off the tracks. Some 3 million of them between the years 1946 and 2002. By the autumn, all that was left standing was the original brick-built Standard Motor Company building, the offices A, B and C blocks, the Ferguson Museum and the old Massey Ferguson Service Centre. A Massey Ferguson memorial to the tractor production facility has been erected at the site. A Massey Ferguson memorial to the tractor production facility has been erected at the site. Massey Ferguson developed the Banner Lane site and at one stage it was reported to be the biggest AGCO manufacturing facility in the world and was headquarters of AGCO's European, Middle and Far Eastern operations. The famous tower block was officially opened in September 1966 and had office space for some 500 people. So I spoke with some engineers and technical trainers who were based in the famous tower block, and they shared some interesting information. Ian Lee started at Banner Lane in July 1991 in what was then the Product Service Department, T11, of the tower block. He originally started as a senior technical trainer for 12 months and then was promoted to technical training manager. He wrote all the training manuals for the 200 and 300 series and did all the update courses for the 1212 and 18.6 gearboxes. He also trained the trainers in all European countries and North America and travelled to most of these countries when it got taken over. He noted that there was a lot of rearranging and centralised operations after its purchase in 1994. He had an on-site product training centre built at Banner Lane in H12 Test House. That was the Hurricane Engine Test House facility on the site, as previously they had to work along with Stoneley's availability. So that's the Stoneley training site that was away from Banner Lane. In late 1995, this facility was closed and all training was done at Stoneley with no trainer were factory based at the time, which obviously was a shame. Many of them were made to reapply for jobs at a lower level and pay rate. He decided to take the opportunity to change direction and become West Regional Service Manager, initially based at Stoneley before they were relocated back to the refurbished tower block at Banner Lane. In 1997, he had promotion to UK and Ireland Service Manager, looking after all agricultural products in these countries, and with the help of 4 area service managers, later went on to support products, obviously, for AGCO. And I'm sure a lot of you listening and watching will be familiar with Ian if you are a Massey Ferguson mechanic, if you're involved in the after sales department of Massey Ferguson in any dealership throughout, obviously, the UK and Ireland, especially in that period. You'd be well familiar with Ian through his training. And of course, if any of you are watching, drop a comment into the comment section if you're working for sales, if you worked in Banner Lane, if you worked in the dealerships at the time, and you have history going back to Banner Lane for training courses or whatever, please drop a comment into the comment section as always. I also spoke to David Blackwood, who was an engineer at Banner Lane from 1990 to 1995, and he went on to say that obviously AGCO had taken over the import and distribution of Massey Ferguson tractors for the US and Canada a year before the buyout, when Varity closed down. So that was the MF North America distribution company that was based in Fort Lauderdale. He said even us engineers had heard about this, but when the announcement was made that AGCO would take over the complete company, it was a bit of a shock. Bob Radcliffe, who was the AGCO founder, came across to the UK shortly after and addressed all senior managers in the function room of the social club. He stated that the AGCO philosophy was to get new products out into the market and sort any problems in the field. And this was, fine. Obviously, when AGCO was only selling in North America, they learned very costly lessons when they launched obviously the 6100 and the 8100 far too early with not enough testing. So I went on to ask him, what was the reason why was there a rush to the market? Why was there a rush to get these machines to the market? Was it to obviously to beat competitors, new machines coming on the market, or was it just to get units out in the field? He went on to say that it was just a mixture of naivety and a touch of arrogance. The AGCO owners didn't understand the rest of the world and felt that what worked in North America would work in the rest of the world. It cost the company millions in numerous rectification programs, cost dealers money and customers, and damaged the reputation of the Beauvais built product. With the later 3000 and 3600 series machines, they had started to rebuild. Thankfully for AGCO, the volume of sales and the majority of the turnover was still coming from the Banner Lane product to offset the losses of the Beauvais products. I asked David if he believed that the writing was on the wall for Banner Lane when AGCO took it over, and he said no, he did not believe so. After the takeover, they spent a lot of money reforming the tower block and putting in new cellular manufacturing system. He believes a few factors contributed to its final demise. By the late 1990s and the early 2000s, the pound was strong against the euro and the US dollar. AGCO North America were struggling to be competitive with the Coventry product in North America. They had started to look at Brazil and India as potential alternative supply sources. Bob Radcliffe even admitted that he'd spoken to the British government telling them that they needed to drop the pound and adopt the euro, otherwise they would close the factory. The other issue was that the driveline used on all Banner Lane tractors was at the limit of the power which could be put through it. It was obviously with the 399 and the 4270 series with the Perkins 1006 engine. Even by the year 2000, the average tractor horsepower in the UK and of course across most of Europe had exceeded 110 horsepower. That was the largest size produced in Coventry. To tool up to develop a new driveline to take the higher power and torque loadings from the Tier 1 compliant engines would have cost the company millions. And of course you have to bear in mind that the machining transfer line being used was basically that was put in for the TE20s with a few tweaks to machine the heavier duty rear axle trumpet housings for the outboard epicyclics. The way AGCO looked at it, they had a driveline made in France which could easily take up to 200 horsepower, so why spend the money to tool up for a complete new driveline in the UK also? David also went on to admit that the thing that caused the most upset with those engineers when AGCO took over was that they took away their half day working on a Friday. Prior to takeover, they worked 7:30 a.m. until 12:40 p.m. on a Friday, basically shop floor hours, until they made them change the hours from 8 o'clock in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday and take a longer lunch, and they were not very happy with that whatsoever. So with the completion of the final Banner Lane built tractor, a four-wheel drive Massey Ferguson 4345 on the 24th of December 2002, followed by the last transaxle in mid-2003, Massey Ferguson, subsidiary of AGCO since 1994, ceased UK production. Undoubtedly, the loss of manufacturing plant was a great blow to the Midlands, although the announcement of the closure was not altogether surprising. Some 85% of production went abroad. Currency also did not favour production in the UK, and Britain's refusal to adopt the euro compounded the plant's problems. Now you have to bear in mind the amount of people that were working in Banner Lane at the time, and the amount of surrounding business that it would have created, the amount of companies, shops that would have heavily relied on supplying Banner Lane. It wasn't just the staff in the factory that were affected, of which there were thousands, not just the engineers, not just the office staff, canteen workers, cleaners, janitors, general operatives, and then outside all the suppliers that supplied everything from food to parts, machinery to steel. Everything that went into that factory was affected. It would have been a colossal, huge blow to the area. Of course, this was not the first time that Massey Ferguson had, been troubled by currency problems. It is well documented that merger talks between Harry Ferguson and Massey Harris almost broke down due to a clash over the pound-dollar exchange rate. However, this was settled on a loss for one, and that of course was Harry Ferguson, and it made him poorer to the tune of $1 million. Back in the heady days of the 50s, the 60s, 70s and 80s, Banner Lane was riding on the crest of a wave. Some 60 to 75,000 tractors and complete knockdown units left the factory on an annual basis, peaking at 90,000 tractors in 1976, compared to production figures of 28,000 units in 1996, and half that figure towards the end of the 1990s, with an estimated 15,000 produced in the factory's final year. A Massey Ferguson tractor is said to be sold every 4 minutes. They can still be seen working throughout the world and are currently sold in 140 countries. They are as popular as ever in Britain, and AGCO had retained a presence in the Midlands by locating its European, African and Middle Eastern headquarters at Abbey Park, Stairton, as well as a purpose-built Massey Ferguson training school, which is based in the Royal Agricultural Showground at Stoneleigh. Of course, the European headquarters has since moved to Switzerland. So to conclude, from the height of production in the 1960s and 70s, when new ranges were being launched and up to 25 people per day were being hired, to the takeover by AGCO, which by all accounts from those I have spoken to was not very favourable towards the employees. There is even a story that in 1 year, a set of diaries were printed with the name Agro was wrote on the front instead of AGCO, and I think this says a lot about the sentiment at the time. The final decision for the closure of the plant was obviously a combination of factors. It is said that the plant was almost too big, and that if production units fell below 20,000 per year, it would effectively leave the plant unviable, and that the land would be worth more for housing. Also, as we spoke about the need to invest millions for a new driveline for larger machines, and of course, global currency markets were not favourable for exporting from the UK. It is also believed that AGCO were well aware that they would face much less opposition, if they were to close the British plant before the French one, because we all know what the French are like when it comes to their jobs and job security. So before the demolition, the vast majority of tooling and equipment was auctioned off to various different buyers. So over the coming years, the factory was demolished section by section to make way for housing and civil amenity projects. The final building to come down was the landmark 16-storey tower block that was brought crashing down to earth on the 8th of July 2012 with a host of explosive charges. That was almost 66 years to the day since the first TE20 rolled off the line.